Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Working? Yes. I'm Megan Crowley-Matoka. I direct the Medical Humanities and Bioethics graduate program, and I am so delighted to welcome you today to a joint session of our weekly Montgomery lecture series that we hold in the MHMB program and the weekly IFAM seminar series. At least 2 or 3 times a year, we find an opportunity to bring our two groups together to explore one of the many overlapping interests that, that we tend to share. And I really couldn't be more delighted to have this opportunity this time for our gathering together to be a chance to hear from our esteemed colleague, Katie Watson. I'm going to go ahead and introduce her, but before I do that, just one quick housekeeping thing. We are a hybrid, so there are folks joining us online. And for those of you online who want to jump into the question and answer session at the end, please direct your questions not to the chat, which is how we sometimes do it in the MHMB series, but rather to the Q&A in your Zoom screen. So that said, Katie Watson, JD, is an associate professor of medical education, medical social sciences, and obstetrics and gynecology, and a faculty member, we are very lucky to say, in the medical humanities and bioethics graduate program here at Northwestern's Feinberg School of Medicine, where she is an award-winning teacher of medical ethics, medical humanities, and constitutional law. Professor Watson's articles on abortion ethics and practice have appeared in publications including the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, The Lancet, and The New Yorker. She's the co-editor of Reproductive Ethics in Clinical Practice, out in 2021 from Oxford, and she's the author of Scarlet A, The Ethics, Law, and Practice of Ordinary Abortion, which came out in 2018, also with Oxford, and which the New York Times described recently as revolutionary and recommended as one of 10 books to understand the abortion debate in the United States. So we're pretty lucky to have her here with us. Professor Watson is a member of the Northwestern Memorial Hospital Ethics Committee, the Ethics Committee of the International Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics, and the Planned Parenthood National Medical Council. And she's a former member of the boards of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities and the board of the National Abortion Federation, as well as the editorial board of the AMA and the AMA Journal of Ethics. So I truly cannot imagine a scholar better equipped to try and help illuminate the incredibly tumultuous waters of our current reproductive healthcare situation. So please help me welcome her.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you. My friend Erin was a first-time mom of a very small baby, and she was so proud of herself when she took her first flight with that baby to visit her in-laws. On the way back, when her in-laws dropped her off at the airport in Kansas City, she realized she didn't feel well, but thought, oh, it'll pass. Got on the airplane, and in the middle seat of an economy airline began vomiting. Her baby on her lap began vomiting too. They both had the same stomach bug, apparently, and she describes it like just twin volcanoes in conversation. So imagine being packed into that airplane. The people on either side of her were horrified. And she describes the entire flight being a nightmare as flight attendants just held out paper towels like this. And she held it together, made it to the airport, gets to O'Hare, down to the baggage claim. Again, it's so gross, covered in vomit, and pulls her stroller off the baggage claim and realizes, as anyone who's dealt with a heavy-duty stroller knows, you can't unlock it with one hand. So she's struggling with the stroller with one hand, holding a howling, writhing, vomit-slicked baby in the other, and realize this isn't happening. And she doesn't feel like she can set Dottie down on the floor and in the trample stampede of O'Hare. And that's when she says she just lost it. She just starts crying in the airport, sobbing with her stroller and her baby. And a man appears from the crowd and says, "You look like you need some help." And she's like, "Yeah." And he holds out his hand toward her head and says, "Lord, help this woman and her baby." And Erin is a weekly churchgoer. She doesn't mind this. She thinks, if I have to stand still to be prayed over as the price of somebody opening my stroller, fine. And he finishes his prayer, smiles at her beatifically, and then walks away. Now, for those of you who are thinking, maybe I'm in the wrong room, I thought we were here to talk about abortion, let me assure you that that is what I'm here to talk about. And I do want to address first the reversal of Roe. But I also want to offer a new premise that, because the title of my talk is Roe 2.0, and I am looking forward. I am no longer looking backward. And I want to argue today that we are remiss if we talk about abortion without also talking about childcare and child welfare and child policy in the United States. And this is, I could have pulled from many maps. Oh, we have a thing on the screen. Let me see if I can, or get rid of that. I crushed it. Tech, not my strong suit. So this is a map from the Annie Casey Foundation from 2022, looking at 4 domains of child health: economics, education, health, and family and community. And the darker color is states that are faring the worst, and the lighter is the best. And I want to argue that when we talk about this map, we should also talk about this map. And I want to ask you in the Q&A what you make of the overlap between these two maps. Let me pull it out. I spent way too much time making tiny red boxes to not share this with you. 75% of states that are in the bottom quartile for child welfare have passed abortion bans. Only 25 states, 25% of states have those bans in the top quartile. 75% in the first and second quartile allow abortion, right? It's flipped. I think this is unacceptable. So today I want to talk about where we are in terms of abortion policy and the reversal of Roe, but I also want to talk about where we might go as we envision a better future. And I want to start by sharing something about my approach to abortion ethics and abortion policy. My basketball career began and ended in 7th grade. Terrible, terrible, so uncoordinated. But the one thing I remember, and that has actually influenced me to this day, is the idea that when you're trying to defend someone, you don't look at their head, because the head can lie, it can fake you out. You follow the body. And it was only recently that I realized that's kind of the guidance for all of my scholarship in ethics. If I was going to give you a talk on the ethics of abortion, I might spend a lot of time going over philosophical principles and conflicts about the moral status of embryos and fetuses. But what I would prefer to talk about is the ethics of access. Because when we follow the body and look at the epidemiology, what we see is abortion is surprisingly common in the United States. 20% of all US pregnancies end in abortion, and that's exclusive of miscarriage care. 42% of unintended pregnancies, and we don't have a way right now in the research to separate unwanted and unintended. Many of us are that third whoops baby who was mistimed but entirely welcome, right? But I'm going to call at least those 42% probably unwanted. And 1 in 4 women will have abortion by menopause. You'll hear me in this lecture interchangeably use the words women and people. I use the words people because I want to be inclusive of anyone with a uterus who doesn't identify as a woman. And I want to keep the word woman because so much of what I want to talk about links to a historical gender discrimination and the gender discrimination that we still see to this day. So who cares? As a mother and an ethicist, everybody is doing it is not a compelling argument. However, what I realized when I wrote my book was we hear more about the idea of abortion than the experience of abortion because it's such a stigmatized topic. And even scholars talk about it as if it's this data-free zone, which it is not. There's terrific public health and sociological research that's come out in the last 10 to 15 years, but it's slower to inform the mainstream debate. And as a clinical ethicist, I absolutely respect and expect that there's a wide range of opinions on the ethics of abortion in this room. As a clinical ethicist, my primary focus is what do patients think? What do patients want? And can they live by their moral frameworks and their vision and their light, follow their North Star for their family, right? I reject the idea that any one individual has cornered the moral market on speaking on behalf of embryos and fetuses. We are all former embryos and fetuses, and I think we're all entitled to this incredibly wide spectrum of opinions on the ethics of abortion. So today I'll focus on the ethics of access. And I just want to be clear that this doesn't mean I'm ignoring the ethics of abortion. It means I'm following the incredibly basic primary observation of the premise of the 70s ethics revolution, which is that patients are moral agents. Patients are moral decision makers. We don't need to make up moral frameworks for them. They come with them. And when I spent 3 days in Oklahoma City at an abortion clinic that was absolutely slammed with the flood of patients after Texas passed SB 8 prohibiting abortion after cardiac activity, detectable cardiac activity, I asked patients not just about the trauma emotions of traveling from Texas, but I asked them about their ethical frameworks. And I had such interesting conversations, and there was no hesitation. People all had their own ethical frameworks, though of course they phrased them as lay people do. And the 201, they had this a very sophisticated, in my opinion, approach to say, well, here's when an abortion wouldn't be ethical for me, but actually I wouldn't legislate that on other people because I think other people have different ideas that are just as valid as mine. And I was like, well, that's fancy. That's great. The last quote is one of my favorites. While y'all talking about my vagina, I have been presenting autonomy arguments for a long time, but I'm not sure I've said it as eloquently. So let's focus on where we are now. We are in a world of legal tumult. Many of you have seen these maps in the newspaper. Instead of focusing on the bans, I am going to focus on bans, they are very important. I want to focus on the protected states. And as you may have caught in the first slide, there are 23 states that where we have this pink lilac color, legal and likely to stay this way. 6, the gray color, is legal for now, meaning there's anticipation about new legislative sessions or court changes in those states. So we're kind of in a half and half situation. Some states like Illinois have passed affirmative legislation. We have a Reproductive Health Act that I'll talk about in a moment to protect abortion rights. State constitutions are a really important source of protection to understand. Many of you in this room understand that states can provide more rights than the federal government. The federal government's the floor, states can move up to whatever ceiling they want, and each state constitution is written differently. So we've just recently in the news seen several examples of this. Michigan voters in November voted on a ballot initiative to add an amendment to their constitution, to add language saying abortion is explicitly protected in our state constitution. The state courts can't mess with that. They can interpret it, but they can't mess with it. State Supreme Courts have interpreted their own state constitutions, the language that's already there, to cover abortion. In some states, they basically did a Roe analysis with the same language, if their state constitutions had the same due process language, and said, yep, that's true for us too. In South Carolina, you just saw a couple weeks ago, that state constitution includes the word privacy. And so that court said we have protection in South Carolina, which matters so much for that Atlantic South region. In Kansas in 2018, Kansas, not thought of as a hotbed of liberal judicial activism, that state Supreme Court said our Constitution protects abortion. There was a ballot initiative to go the other way, asking voters to add language to the Kansas Constitution to say nothing in this Constitution protects abortion rights. And Kansas voters said, no, thank you, 59% to 41%, preserving that. So we're seeing ballot initiatives. I just want to flag in Iowa, such an interesting story. 2018, also their Supreme Court found state constitutional protections. Their governor, Kim Reynolds, had a President Trump moment where she, because of retirements and deaths, got to replace, I think, 3 members of their state Supreme Court with justices who were painted as conservative jurists, and they reversed that state Supreme Court decision. So the reason Iowa is in the legal for now category is there's anticipation their legislature will make restrictions, which will affect clinicians in Illinois very much, as you see this donut hole we're in. But in Illinois, the day after Dobbs, nothing changed. And we're a Roe state, not even a Casey state. Casey is the 1992 case that affirmed Roe, but it downgraded the abortion right from a fundamental right to a liberty interest. And that's what allowed the flood of regulations like waiting periods, state scripted speeches, and that sort of thing. But in our legislation, we're back to a fundamental right. We also added Medicaid coverage in 2018. The argument that won the day there was a gender equity argument. Why does Medicaid cover all common procedures for men, but not all common procedures for women? And covers childbearing, but not abortion care. That's an issue of economic coercion. Private insurance equity, if your private insurance in Illinois covers childbearing, it needs to cover abortion care. And we repealed our parental notice requirement just last summer, the theory being that, or not theory, the data being that the vast majority of teenagers involve their parents. When they don't, they have very good reasons not to, and they involve other trusted adults. So all these young women going for a judicial bypass, 100% getting the bypass, delaying their abortion care. And it's basically a shaming ritual. But also there's this other story for patients and clinicians. This is a heat map, and it makes me very excited to say that. I've never said that before, and it sounds very CSI to me. But Caitlin Myers is an economist at Middlebury, and she's got this army of students who call an amazing number of abortion clinics every 2 weeks to say, how many patients do you have and where are they coming from? So Illinois is one of the top 4 receiving states. A different study from the Society of Family Planning looked at April, so before the Dobbs decision, August, 2 months after, and saw in that short range, our patient population was up 28%. The other top receiving states are North Carolina, Kansas, and Colorado. So patients are traveling, and this is so important. Some would say, okay, so many people are still getting their abortions, so it's fine. I have a lot of trouble with that for multiple reasons. It's forcing people to undergo these trips that are very expensive, time-consuming, feel like criminals, have to find childcare, get time off work, and find the funding for this, which sometimes is their own, sometimes is through private organizations. People donate funds to help them travel. I don't think this is sustainable, and I don't think the money will continue to be there to support the travel for all the patients who need that support. Medication abortion is a really important part of the current landscape that everyone in this room, I think, would be well advised, as all of us have to be the cocktail party expert on the issues in the news in our worlds, even if this isn't our area of clinical care. Over half of abortions now are done with medication, which essentially creates the same process as a first trimester miscarriage. It's used in the United States up to 11 weeks. It's a 2 medicine regimen. The FDA allowed it to be prescribed by telemedicine, which is huge. And then just, 2-3 weeks ago, dropped the requirement of in-person delivery. It used to be you had to show up at the clinic to have a doctor hand you the pill. And the doctor had to stock the pill in their office, which was an incredible barrier to your ordinary OBGYN or internal medicine or family medicine person prescribing this for you, because they don't want to have a little refrigerator of pills they use 5 times a year. It's just a whole different burden. From a regulatory, a legal, and a medical perspective, this is not news. This move is so far overdue. We have so much data on the safety of these drugs, but because it's abortion, it's front page news. But one impact is that patients from banned states can drive right across Illinois state lines, park in the parking lot of a CVS, do a telemedicine appointment on their phone, go pick up the medication, and then the clinician will advise them to take it in Illinois, but can't control where they take it. Before, they would come to the telemedicine appointment and then wait a day to get it mailed to them, general delivery at a post office, or they just would have to make it to the clinic to have it handed to them. So this does really affect access. There's another access piece outside the formal medical system called self-managed abortion. This is a piece of political art from Shout Your Abortion, which, as a lawyer, I'm a real Supreme Court worshiper, and I find this poster powerful. It's the same medications, but without the doctor's visit. So people looking for self-managed abortion, I'm not endorsing any of these websites, but go to websites like these. Plan C is an organization that tests pills from different pharmacies to make sure they are what they say they are, coming from international pharmacies, and gives recommendations. Aid Access is a group founded by a Dutch doctor named Rebecca Gompers that mails the pills. So these pills are coming from India, they're coming from Europe, because Rebecca Gompers isn't afraid of Texas, right? They don't have jurisdiction to come after her in Europe. They don't have jurisdiction to come after an Indian pharmacy, and they haven't tried to reach that far. So folks are on the internet ordering pills, taking them at home and ending their pregnancies at home pretty safely. They may have concerns about bleeding and cramping. They may show up in emergency rooms. I think we're going to see an uptick in emergency room care for complications if they don't have a doctor to call to say, is this normal? I feel scared. And some of them, a very small percent, will need follow-up care because they didn't complete their abortion and need a uterine evacuation. So it's important to understand that element. This Society of Family Planning study showed that abortion by clinicians dropped 6%, but we don't know how many of those patients used SMA. So a huge number traveled, but we won't know how many of that 6% were forced to continue pregnancies they don't want and how many handled it at home until we see the birth records and the population data 9 to 12 months after Dobbs. So this is an open question. So let me shift gears here. Away from the law and toward the patients and the demographics and the lived experience, because to understand who these bans affect the most, you have to understand who the patient population is. Not everyone understands that half of abortion patients have incomes under the poverty level. Another quarter are in that 100 to 200% range, and that the majority, 62%, and a disproportionate number, are non-white. So we have poor people and people of color who are most affected by these bans. And I will get to gender in a moment, but they are all people with uteruses, the vast majority of whom identify as women. This summer, I published an article asking, why don't we talk about the need for abortion care as a health disparity? We've got race, we've got economics, we've got gender, right? And so for me, it's maybe an issue of abortion exceptionalism. We treat abortion like it's so utterly different than all other medical issues. And it is different in the same way that pediatric ethics and issues are different and organ transplant is different. Everything has its unique aspects, but they also have things in common. And I think in abortion, sometimes we miss the things that this procedure and this debate have in common with other medical issues. Why are so many women of color represented in those numbers? Well, one of the primary, though not the exclusive factor, is the tragic overlap and as a product of structural racism of people of color in those statistics of people who are poor. But it's also an issue of pregnancy and pregnancy prevention. Poor women have 5 times more unintended pregnancies than women with incomes above 200% of the poverty line. My income is over 200%, so I'll say my group is not crushing it. 30% of our pregnancies are unintended, but 60% are unintended in women who are under the poverty line. So when you think about the economic angle, it makes sense that a group with more unintended pregnancies, then you'd see them utilizing abortion services more. That just makes sort of mathematical sense. The result is that abortion use is increasingly concentrated among poor women over the last 2+ decades. But a statistic no one seems to talk about is that higher income women terminate a higher percentage of their unintended pregnancies. So women in my income bracket, 30% of our pregnancies are unintended and we terminate 48% of those. Women with incomes under the poverty line have a higher number of unintended pregnancies, terminate 38%. Look at the difference in delivery of unintended pregnancies, 9 per thousand versus 60 per thousand. Now, is that difference in what percent are terminated a difference in values? Is it a difference in access to abortion services? I would hypothesize a large piece of it is that. Is it a difference in feeling like, well, will things be different 5 years from now? In my relationship status, my economic status, and also planning is a value. versus fate, accepting what life gives you. You know, there's so many things going on here. We don't have research to tell us about this. We're barely talking about race and poverty and abortion right now. And I think we should talk more. Well, so why do these 1 in 4 women end pregnancies? This is one of those Guttmacher studies of thousands of women across the United States, and they were invited to check as many reasons as pertained, and the median number was 4. So again, a multifactorial decision making. But look at can't afford a baby now is the number 2 reason, almost tied for number 1. And then when asked what's the most important reason, can't afford a baby still is very high. I want to highlight for you what is often associated as a white feminist narrative that abortion care is needed so women can finish school or be successful in their careers and defer childbearing, only shows up as a direct, most important answer 4% of the time. Now, I'm not here to rank or suggest one reason for an abortion is better. I think whatever your reason is the right reason, but I think our political and social narratives are a little out of alignment with the patient experience of why people need abortions, and how many in that 23%, not all, but how many, if they had the economic means, would continue those pregnancies. So is that really a choice? An obstetrician I collaborate with at Harvard, she just said this in conversation, and I thought it was so fantastic. She's influenced, as I am, by the reproductive justice movement. And she said to me once, I don't use the word choice. I always use the word decision. I think it takes a lot to have a real choice. And I just thought that was powerful to think about the difference between decisions, giving whatever least bad alternative you have, versus an actual choice. What does that look like? I also want to highlight the difference between something I've just very recently come to call the difference between availability and accessibility. So abortion is available in these pink, gray, and while lawsuits and injunctions proceed, yellow states. That means it's legal. But if you don't have the money, it doesn't matter if you live next door to an abortion clinic in a state where it's legal. Right? That's accessible. So this is a map that shows you where the Hyde Amendment rules the day. The Hyde Amendment, many of you understand, is a federal, it's an appropriations rider that's renewed every year that says federal Medicaid dollars can't be used for anything having to do with abortion care. The state Medicaid is a state-federal partnership, and the states in green have said, well, our state funds will cover that. We don't need the federal matching dollars. We'll cover it. But in the Black states, those are the states where it's completely dark in terms of Medicaid funding for either state or federal. So what this means is women who are insured by Medicare have to pay out of pocket for abortion care, which we're talking a minimum average of $500, and it goes up as you progress in gestational age. This is a racially discriminatory policy when you realize that Black, Hispanic, and Native women are 2 times as likely to be insured by Medicaid as than white or Asian women. So there's a racial component to this insurance discrimination as well. So when you look at these maps, I think it's really interesting. Colorado is a great example. Colorado's blue. It's got great protection. It's totally legal. It's you saw it was a destination state, but they don't have Medicaid coverage. So you could be that person in Colorado who says it's available, but not accessible to me. Sarah Roberts at UCSF is a colleague and friend who did, I think, just such an elegant study. Instead of talking to women in abortion clinics, she went to Louisiana and talked to women in prenatal care clinics and asked them, what's your insurance? How are you insured? And did you ever consider not going forward with this pregnancy? And if you did consider it and then chose to continue it, what was the reason you didn't have an abortion? And counted the number of women who said, because Medicaid doesn't cover an abortion. I couldn't afford it. That's why I'm here at the prenatal clinic. And doing the math, that estimated every year approximately 3,000 Louisiana women insured by Medicaid give birth instead of having an abortion. I couldn't come up with $500, does not seem like a great life start story of why you had that child. So I want to be clear to not live in a fantasy world that we had total access before Roe and Dobbs changed everything. Dobbs changed a great deal, but we didn't live in a complete access environment before that. We have to think about, when we think about racial disparities, our terrible gulf in maternal mortality and morbidity. People in this room know about this gulf, but forcing pregnant people with the demographics I just showed you to continue pregnancies is going to increase this rate of maternal morbidity and mortality. It also pushes people to later gestational ages. In 2016, 80% of all abortions in the US occurred at the embryonic stage, 10 weeks or less. And is that a distinction with a difference? I mean, that is completely up to you, but I find in American discourse, the word fetus is used from conception on. And because we're in a medical school environment, I try to always use the medically appropriate language and the clunkier phrase, embryos and fetuses. Again, you may think that's all the same, or you may think there's a difference as gestational age goes on and there is embryonic and fetal development. But these were our statistics before. 88% were in the first trimester. I predict next year at this time, when we start to get more data, you're going to see these numbers go up in terms of gestational age because of the need for travel, the time it takes to raise even more money for that. And abortion is a safe procedure medically, but the risks do go up every week that you move forward. And so that maternal morbidity number, people are being forced to stay pregnant longer. And so we have more of an opportunity for all of the secondary effects of pregnancy on people with underlying health conditions. The Turnaway study was another really interesting study done by Diana Green Foster at UCSF, where she was very interested. She oversampled women who were later in pregnancy, who were likely to be turned away from a clinic because they were at a later gestational age past what that clinic would care for. So she looked at those patients. So she had a wide range in terms of gestational age. What she noticed, just one of the findings of the study, which I found so fascinating, the difference between people who got their abortion in the first trimester and 20 plus weeks was discovering their pregnancy, a 7-week gap. People don't notice they're pregnant at the same time, right? Bodies are different, lives are different. But the access delays increased the difference by another 7 weeks. So you had a 14-week gap. So the first trimester patients, they noticed that they're pregnant, and then 3 weeks later, they get their abortion, 8 weeks. The 20-week patient group, they noticed they're pregnant at about 12 weeks, but then it takes them another 10 to get there. So they're at 22 weeks. So for folks who feel like that second trimester abortion is more troubling ethically than first trimester abortion, the policy position to take would be to oppose all restrictions on abortion care for people who are trying to get to clinics and are being delayed by structural barriers. And we're going to see more of this in the coming years that these bans are here. So I've talked about race, I've talked about SES. I also want to talk about gender when we think about healthcare disparities. 6 months ago, when the Supreme Court reversed Roe, it was the first time in history the Supreme Court had reversed a major civil rights precedent. It had reversed cases before, but it had never taken away rights. Those reversals typically extended more rights to Americans. So it's a large historical decision, not just in terms of abortion care. I want to read between the lines here and suggest to you something more dire. What the court essentially ruled is that women's personhood is not protected by the Constitution. And here's why I say that. The court ruled that a state government may decide that an embryo has as many or more rights than the person in whom it lives. The court did not explicitly say that embryos are people under the Constitution. That would be an utterly unsupportable argument from any originalist or other kind of analysis. So without saying this, it said, well, it's not in the Constitution, so the states can make that decision. So what they essentially did is downgrade women's personhood to allow for that kind of balance. The Constitution is not a laundry list, right? Or excuse me, a grocery list. It doesn't use the word contraception. It doesn't use the word marriage. It doesn't use the word abortion. There are many words it doesn't use. So to say that all the rest of the substantive due process precedents still stand, but the abortion one, we can pull that out of the Jenga pile. We can pull that out separately without explicitly saying so, is saying that women aren't people under the Constitution. That actually shouldn't shock us because the legal recognition of women's personhood in the United States is historically very recent. We can't talk about women as a monolithic group. We have to acknowledge that it wasn't until the abolition of slavery that women of African descent had any claim to legal personhood under the US Constitution. And before that, Married Women's Properties Act, it took a half century for these to be passed state by state. But before that, I had no legal standing separate than my father and then separate than my husband when I married. I had no separate legal personhood, right? I couldn't sign a contract. I couldn't hold money in my own name because of my gender status. The Seneca Falls Declaration calls that women are civilly dead, which is really important concept. I'm going to talk about the Bradwell case in a moment. And then it's just important to remember, it's only been 100 years since women in the US have had the right to vote. A long time in some ways, and historically speaking, an incredibly short period of time. And then I'm going to share with you another case I love to hate, Hoyt versus Florida. So this case is close to my heart because Mrs. Bradwell was a lawyer in Illinois, and I have to say Mrs. because the case hinged on her marital status. She went to law school, she applied for a legal license and was denied because women in Illinois, like so many other states in the country, couldn't sign a legal contract in their own name. Only their husband could sign that contract. And they said, well, you can't practice law because you can't sign a contract with a client to be their lawyer. She appealed this to the Supreme Court. She was a really good lawyer. And her husband had a legal practice. So she's not the one, of course, who got to argue it, but she's the one who got to write everything. And the Supreme Court basically tried to handle it as a procedural matter, an administrative law. We're not going to mess with the state regulation of professions. But 3 justices just couldn't stand it and wrote a concurring opinion that basically just screamed, it's because she's a girl. And they wrote an opinion that is a great summary of what's called the 2 spheres philosophy, the idea that women belong in the private sphere at home, the domestic sphere, and men belong in the public sphere. So this isn't a Supreme Court opinion, that her mission is to be a wife and a mother. And the idea that she tried to go out and get a job is against the laws of God, and we're on the Supreme Court, so we're also enforcing the laws of God. Again, over 100 years ago, but this is just an important articulation of that 2 spheres philosophy. In Hoyt, Mrs. Hoyt was accused of murdering her husband in what may have been what we might think of today as a domestic violence situation. He was drunk, she had a baseball bat, and she was convicted by an all-male jury of murder. There had been a hot run of Supreme Court cases saying Black people could not be convicted of by all white juries, that was not a jury of their peers. And she said, hey, I think that should apply to me too in terms of equal protection. A jury of my peers would have to include women, and Florida doesn't include women in the jury pools. And the Supreme Court said, we're very groovy now in 1961, but women are still the center of home and family life. And so Florida it's constitutional for Florida to say women don't have to be on jury duty, and they allowed women to volunteer. And guess how many women volunteered? Unless she determines that going to be on a jury and hearing these yucky things about crimes is consistent with her own special responsibilities. And I just call that parenting now, but special responsibilities is the language of the day. That was reversed later, but I just want us to understand how historically recent the idea that women could move in both a domestic sphere and a public sphere, as men have always done, is historically recent and is not going to be sustained without effort. This just situates the issue with the legislation. We get 63, you can't pay women less just because they're women. The 64, you can't not hire them just because they're women. Oh, look, we have the first contraceptive case, which is a reaction to female-controlled contraception, the invention of the pill. And so we get the Eisenstadt, single people can use contraception as well constitutionally. Then 72, radical idea, you can't keep them out of college just because they're women. Then we get abortion rights the next year. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act says you can't fire someone just because they're pregnant, which was common practice. And then 92, we affirm Casey. And Justice O'Connor's opinion still stuck with the privacy framing, but she all but, in her rhetoric, embraced the equal protection framing. And look at that sentence, really talks about women in the public sphere, that you have to be able to control your reproductive destiny to move between both spheres. And then 93, the next year, the really radical legislation, hold our jobs, we're coming back, right? After pregnancy, that this idea that we will flow back and forth and that we will integrate these spheres is in the public consciousness. Now, raise your hand if you feel familiar with the reproductive justice framing. I'm not calling on anyone, basic understandings. When I was in law school, my fellowship was in reproductive freedom, which is a right to be left alone. That's the government out of my bedroom idea. Reproductive justice is a robust approach to say, developed by women of color, saying, really what we need is a positive right to be assisted. We need a right to not have children, but we also need a right to have children. White middle class women's right to be fertile, be pregnant, and to parent the children they have has never been challenged. But ours has been challenged, beginning with a history of slavery onto forced sterilization histories and other histories of the foster care system, devastating families of color for the crime of being poor, and on and on and on. The other idea is that if you center marginalized people in policy making, you'll take care of everyone, as opposed to centering white middle class straight women. Other people will be left out by those policies. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to go quickly but I want to say that for me as an ethicist, the reproductive justice framing has helped me think about a more robust way to use the principle of justice in medical ethics and medical care. So the contraception cases and the abortion cases, this is just examples of this negative right, the government out of my bedroom kind of language, privacy, freedom of conscience, liberty. However, the reproductive justice idea was developed 2 years after Casey, when Black women in Chicago were approached and asked to support the Clinton health plan, which at that time had already deleted reproductive care in an effort to not be controversial. And their perspective was, reproductive care is so many women's first and sometimes only point of contact with the healthcare system. You've already cut us out and you want our support? You cut us out in your first draft. Why would we support that? And the intellectual contribution of Black feminism here cannot be overstated. The idea that we need a whole new framework that's more about human rights than negative constitutional rights. And this wonderful organization called Sister Song was founded in Atlanta. So I want us to reorient in this Roe Point 2.0 approach to how can we keep both the right to not have children and the right to have children in mind. Well, I want to highlight a different part of this chart, which is 59% of abortion patients already have children. And I got to be honest, it's one of those things you don't know you had an assumption until it's disrupted. Mothers aren't who I pictured in an abortion clinic, right? And this is my addition from other research. 88% of the patients are dating or married to the man they got pregnant with. We talk about these people in isolation, and sometimes it leads us to forget, when does sex happen? Often in the context of love and romance and family and relationship, and also in the context of motherhood. So I just want to highlight one article for you that I did with an MA student that I'm very proud of. There was only one article in the literature considering how motherhood and family formation might influence women's abortion decisions. And that was just a secondary analysis from Guttmacher data, where Guttmacher had interviewed a group of women who were in that large quantitative research study, and 38 out of 39 of them, though it was not in the interview guide, brought up their mothering role in talking about their reasons for abortion. In this study, we got to review years of notebooks that patients in a clinic had just written spontaneously, so there's no interviewer influence. And what we found that half of the patients said that their existing children or potential children would be better off as a result of their abortion. So we call this maternal reasoning. Again, I'm not trying to valorize any particular reason for having an abortion, but just to highlight the paucity of our conversation around abortion and the context in which these abortion decisions are made. So these are just two representative quotes. So where are we now? In closing, I think that I understand that many people are uncomfortable talking about abortion. I understand that it's a stigmatized topic. For me, I'm so comfortable talking about it because what I'm really talking about is pluralism. A country that can have mandatory childbearing policies, which is what we currently have in those 14 states, is a country that can order mandatory childlessness. And that is not either country I want to live in. Government neutrality in terms of family formation and reproductive decision-making is what I advocate in my work, because those are private conversations for families, individuals, and then sometimes in conjunction with their doctors. So with Roe 2.0, I don't want to go back. I don't want Roe back. I want something better. I want protection for abortion rights and the right to not have a child, but I want better protections for the right to have a child. I want that affirmative government support for people who do choose to bear children, because I think raising functional citizens is both a very private enterprise and is also a social good in a democracy that should be supported for people who choose to do it. I think of this, I put, these girls are darling, but also this photo is here because I think of it as mitten clip legislation. I want to have reproductive rights clipped to child welfare legislation. Right? I want both. And at minimum, I want that swath of states that is banning abortion to be the first to pony up in terms of child welfare. What I've observed in my work in abortion is that our right to not have children has become painfully public, but our right to have children has remained painfully private. The lack of support for American families, I think, has to end. And I think that an affirmative reproductive vision requires both. So my work in obstetrics is going to expand to pediatrics and thinking about why is Illinois in the second quartile, not the first, and what can we do to move that? I have for 6 months been insisting our RHA makes us a standard of care state, not a haven state. It's not like we're Eden. We're not doing anything awesome. We're doing like what ACOG says we are required to do. Just several days ago, amendments were passed in the Illinois legislature that will convert my language to saying, now I think we're a haven state because we are protecting our doctors. We're protecting out-of-state doctors who get charged with crimes and letting them be licensed here, saying if it was legal under the RHA, you can come practice here. We get it. We get it that wasn't fair. And allowing temporary permits for folks to come here and practice. So we're protecting our clinicians, and you can resist an out-of-state subpoena if you're a patient or a clinician saying, we are not going to participate in this game of what other states are trying to do. I think now we've earned the title of a haven state. This weekend, I'm going to a party in an abortion clinic. That is a sentence I have never said before in my life. But again, this year is unusual. The medical director of this Chicago clinic said to me at a conference a couple months ago, I really want to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Roe, except Roe got reversed. So am I crazy? And I told her, no, I think of it as a celebration of life for a beloved grandmother. We mourn that she passed too soon. Those of us who loved her can privately say she was not perfect. And then you look around the room and you see how many children she had and how much they look like her and how very busy they are. Like this clinician who has doubled her clinic size and expanded her hours and expanded her staff to welcome out-of-state patients. And you celebrate everyone in the room who is carrying her legacy forward. Thank you. I welcome your questions in the room, and I understand we have folks on Zoom who might text them in. I'll start.
Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Thank you for an amazing talk. Really eye-opening in so many ways. And my comment or question is not meant at all to detract from the incredibly important justice and autonomy needs of women and underrepresented people and people in lower income states. But I'm really also interested in the last bits that you were talking about related to practitioners.
Yeah.
And practitioners' rights. And it strikes me that as a clinician, I feel like all clinicians ought to be highly concerned when the government starts to legislate how I can or cannot practice.
Mhm.
And at some level, I feel like there is another kind of autonomy discussion around that. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that and in general, or what as clinicians we ought to be doing or thinking, given the fact that the government is literally starting to tell us what they think is medically acceptable or not.
Absolutely. I think Kelly asked, does that catch on the Zoom or no? They're good? Okay, good. I think that's a really important point. And the legislative interference with the patient-clinician relationship is something we've been seeing over the last decade plus, increase from like laws saying pediatricians can't ask about gun ownership or guns in the home. You know, we have, I'm going to say kind of isolated examples. And then this is a huge one. I want to be candid, though. On the other hand, the Supreme Court has said states can legislate whether assisted dying is appropriate medical practice, right? So states have a role in the regulation of medical practice. I think this one has gone way too far because we have ACOG saying this is necessary. The ACOG Ethics Committee years ago saying abortion care is necessary for women's health. Right. So it's not an issue of value. Should it be allowed from a medical perspective is an issue of health. And we know historically that abortion bans don't end abortion. They just make abortion less safe. And I think when people say we're going back to the before Roe times, well, there's no time machine. We're not going back. We're going to less abortion rights now, and medication abortion is going to change that safety profile. So I think that the clinician point is an absolutely huge one. And I think banding together is an understanding when you look at these statutes, they range from West Virginia, it's a licensure action if a clinician violates it, to Texas, it's up to life in jail if you perform an abortion. So it's not like a fine or a license thing. It's a very hardcore felony. So clinicians are reasonably terrified of these laws. And just yesterday, I was hearing one of our clinicians talking about a patient from Texas who came here, no fetal heartbeat, complete miscarriage. Her doctor wouldn't touch her to empty her uterus. And she ends up coming to Chicago to have a uterine evacuation after a miscarriage. I mean, the patient harm. I was in Oregon and hearing a story about a patient who was pregnant with a wanted pregnancy seeking psychiatric care because she was so depressed and saying, I'm not sure with the way my mental health is right now, I should continue this pregnancy. Her mental health provider saying, well, you just mentioned abortion. And if you end up having an abortion, I'll be charged with aiding and abetting so I can help you. She flew to Oregon. She was a person of means to get psychiatric care, got stabilized and was able to decide to continue this wanted pregnancy. Why would these people have to travel for care, right? So the clinicians are being punished in incredible ways. And the threat to medicine on a broader level, I think, is not understated. Thank you. Here. Yeah, let's do that. And then we have a Zoom question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question. It was not presented. What about male birth control? Is that something that can be enhanced in order to be equal?
Yeah, the question is, what about male birth control? Is that something that could be enhanced?
Yes.
To be equal?
Correct. Thank you.
I am not a pharmacologist or a researcher in that area. My understanding of the research is that the projects to develop male birth control are very limited. It is physiologically difficult, but at the same time, you don't get it unless you try. There was one trial of male contraception that was stopped because it made men's bodies feel uncomfortable. They didn't like the feeling of it, and it was widely criticized that welcome to the world of contraception, right? But the trial was stopped. So it's very hard. I also like even looking at that, the gender disparity is incredible. And I didn't get a chance to this talk. I was talking about pregnant people, but all the male partners who were so affected by abortion bans, where they also wanted to end that unwanted pregnancy, right? And their lives are so impacted by what happens. And we talk about it as a women's issue, and it is legally, but it's socially, it's absolutely a family issue in so many ways. I also really always noticed, I was a volunteer attorney representing teenagers in Illinois going for those judicial bypasses, that the young man's father, who was the young man who was 50% of the pregnancy, his parents didn't know about it, or he didn't have to go to a judge to get a bypass to not tell his parents he had sex. And it seemed like such a gendered shaming ritual. So I think we see this all over. I would welcome more research in male contraception, but it's also the case that we're talking about sex and passion and love and hormones. And so contraception isn't going to completely get us out of the need for abortion, but it can always be improved. There's a question on Zoom.
There's a few questions on Zoom, but I don't think we'll have time. A lot of people wrote in to say thank you. Great. And kudos on a great talk. So here's the first one that came in. Is there a different political process, health procedure, et cetera, where you see such a discrepancy between states? For example, is there something else where states have such a discrepancy and someone is traveling from Texas to Kansas to get service?
No. Next question. No, and wouldn't it just be so bananas if Indiana passed a law saying you could only have one child, and if you try to have another, you can't get hospital care. You can't have any children. And people were traveling to Illinois from Indiana to have a hospital birth. You'd be like, how is that possible? Or if, 20% of our patients for meniscus repair were from out of state, you'd be like, what's the meniscus repair crisis? We don't see this travel, but for women in reproduction, that's what you have to do.
So there's a comment, just want to make sure that we shout out family medicine physicians and clinicians.
Oh, yes.
And then here's a question. What are your thoughts on state laws impact on pharmacies dispensing medication abortion pills? What are the potential outcomes? Will some states be able to dispense, but others cannot? Could it be revoked altogether?
Right. So, just one sentence on the medication abortion. If a state can ban abortion, they can ban all the methods of abortion and ways to do it. There's a problem because these medications are also used for miscarriage and other care. And so there's a crisis in terms of clinicians being afraid to use the medications. And if a state just outright banned a medication completely, there would be a different kind of legal challenge to it. But they are allowed to say, as with the physician-assisted dying, they can say you can use these narcotics for these reasons, but not for these reasons, right? So we are going to see that. The Biden administration, the OIG just issued an opinion saying it's not illegal to send them through the federal mail, which is important and interesting. A different administration could be opening the mail. We have this FDA movement, a different administration, the FDA could move backwards, right? So there's the implication of that question that this is not a secure or stable legal landscape is exactly right. Great.
Sorry, I'll try to be quick.
That's okay.
So I was wondering a little bit about the self-medication thing that you talked about a little bit, because I think it's interesting. I'm not a clinician, I'm a research scientist, and I don't really work in abortion process. I work in transgender healthcare.
Right.
It's a little bit of overlap, but very much also something that's being heavily legislated and contentious. And I just think it's interesting because, we talk a lot about the sort of power relationship between the patient and the state, right? And the state is sort of legislating what the patient can and can't do. There's also this power relationship, you mentioned a bit, between the doctor and the state and between the patient and the doctor, right?
Yep.
There's multiple layers of this. And I think it's interesting because when you think about a lot of the women who are, in the bracket where they're having difficulty accessing abortion, when they go to the healthcare provider, a lot of times that healthcare provider doesn't even look like her, doesn't live like her. And that's something that like is going to impact just comfort levels. And now we have this added layer where the doctor has to protect their own liability even more. And is refusing to provide care on that grounds. But I was wondering, because I feel like self-medication is really interesting for the bioethical framework for people resisting that power relationship.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you like had any more stuff you could say about that.
So let me say in brief, you may not be surprised to say I'm support choice. And so for some people that self-medication is very liberating, and they wanted to use it when abortion was legal. They want to use it in states in which abortion is legal because they're like, I don't want to see a doctor. I have either a cultural community history of doctors not treating me and us well, or I just personally, this feels so private. I don't want to go talk to a stranger about it. I would love to just order a pill from India, take care of this with my roommates and light incense and do my thing, or whatever their ritual is, right? In privacy. Other people would say, I want to go to a clinic and be unpregnant in 5 minutes with an aspiration procedure. I don't want to cramp and bleed for days. If that's not for me, but I have to do it because I don't have other options. So some celebrate self-managed abortion as being this incredibly liberatory thing. And I think in an environment of illegality, it absolutely is compared to like a less safe, what is the opposite of antiseptic? Unantiseptic, septic, dangerous abortion, right? It's such a wonderful pharmacological option, but not everybody actually wants to use it, or it would be their choice. So I think we have to hold that tension of opposites. If it's incredibly liberatory, and when you have to, it's like having a home birth when you're like, I didn't want a home birth. It'll probably be fine, but that's not what I was going for. It makes me scared, whatever it is. So how can we hold onto the liberatory element of you don't even need a doctor? Is that cool? And I actually really wanted to talk to a doctor. Could I please have that option? How can we hold on to both? I understand we're out of time. I'm happy to hang out and talk, but thank you so much for your time, attention, and interest.